I've seen companies like spend more time hiring a junior coordinator than they do vetting a 100K tool per year, signing up for a 2-year contract.
We invest heavily in our tech stack and it costs a lot of money. And so it requires the same level of rigor and scrutiny as it would hiring an individual in any kind of interview or evaluation of candidates or Martech. You obviously need to ensure that it has the fundamental features and it's able to address the gaps that you're looking to solve for. The other piece that's always interesting is hearing other companies' experiences with that product.
What's up, everyone? Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Samia Syed, Director of Growth Marketing at Dropbox. In this episode, we unpack the analogy of treating Martech like your HR and recruiting efforts, like don't buy the tool until you've scoped the job, Backchannel Martech vendors like you're hiring a VP. Martech choices are also culture choices. Every tool deserves a performance review, and proof of concepts are like take-home projects for tools. All that and a bunch more stuff after a super quick word from two of our awesome partners. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Census. You probably have over 15 tools in your marketing tech stack, but how many of them have the full picture of your customer's journey? Census is the universal data layer in your stack. It unifies and cleans data from all your sources and makes it available for any app to use. Census makes it super easy to unify and standardize customer data, then enrich and enhance it, like running deduplication, cleaning, scoring, and routing workflows, and then sync and activate that data across all of your tools so you can actually do something with it. For marketers and data teams that work together to power big campaigns, it's so refreshing to work from a reliable source of truth. Don't just take my word for it though. Census is loved by awesome companies like HubSpot, Perplexity, Canva, Clay, Notion, and many more. Check them out at getcensus.com and tell them we sent you. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Knack. I have the amazing pleasure of chatting with some of the greatest minds in marketing operations, but you'd be shocked at how many of them have the same issues when it comes to their campaign creation process. They're dealing with things like scaling, personalization, keeping assets on brand, render testing emails, working in rigid templates, and worst of all, having to hand code emails. But many of the leaders in the space are using Knack to eliminate these headaches. Knack is a no-code email and landing page creation platform that covers initial campaign requests right until the sync to your marketing automation platform. Knack improves the whole campaign creation process by bringing the building, optimization, testing, collaboration, and also translation functions all in a single spot. So you don't have to jump around and coordinate feedback between a bunch of different people or wait on developers for very simple edits. Because at the end of the day, marketing ops folks want to focus on process and efficiency. Marketers want to focus on creativity, and Knack makes sure you get both and then some. Check them out at knack.com. That's Knak, and tell them we sent you. Samia, thanks so much for your time today. Really excited to chat.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
In our pre-interview chats, you shared a lot of really cool content ideas that we could jump into, but there was one that really jumped out to me, and it was treat your tech stack like your recruitment and HR efforts. This is the first time that I heard anyone say that, and I even Googled it after, and I couldn't find any articles uncovering that. A lot of people are familiar with the treat your tech stack like a product, have a roadmap, and engineers, blah, blah, blah. But this is a really cool angle, and there's so many different ways that we can slice up that analogy. So maybe we can start by just unpacking the core analogy, how that kind of came to be. What if every new tool had the same scrutiny as senior hires? I've seen companies spend more time hiring a junior coordinator than they do vetting a 100K tool per year, signing up for a 2-year contract. Why do you think companies often apply less rigor to 6-figure MarTech investments than hiring decisions?
Yeah, it's interesting you picked that analogy because I think there's so many ways that we can kind of dive into it. And I think you nailed it. We invest heavily in our tech stack and it costs a lot of money. We're committing to at least a year's worth of contract. And so it requires, I think, in my experience, the same level of rigor and scrutiny as it would hiring an individual. Maybe it's not as high care. Obviously, with humans, you need to have higher care, but it does certainly warrant just as much of a high touch experience, in my opinion. And, the reason why I've kind of formulated that opinion and that analogy is because I think over time and over my years of experience, I've seen how quickly and rapidly we adopt tech stack. And oftentimes it just ends up leading into tech debt for a lot of companies. unless you do kind of that upfront due diligence and that, really thoughtful, intentional approach to investing in your tech stack, I think you're oftentimes setting yourself up for a lot of issues down the line. And so I think that's really where it all stems from, is having that same level of intentionality, having that same level of rigor in investing in tech stack as you would in your people.
Yeah, totally agree. I think it's like a cool way to think about it. Like we're obviously the humans of Martech podcast, so it's a really cool analogy that's on brand for us. Maybe we can shout about job description. So obviously, like one of the first things that you figure out when you're going to hire a new person, you have an open rec. You're trying to figure out like what are the roles, responsibilities. I've never really thought of it this way for buying Martech, but I think it's very similar to creating a job description for an open rec. You're making a list of like what are the things that we need to do, what are the use cases that this person or this tool is going to end up doing. You're thinking through, features and requirements. What process do you think you have that's similar to like a job description for scoping out the role of new MarTech tools? And how do you avoid this idea of like buying a solution or hiring someone in search of a problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think even taking a step back before you get into the official job description and the specific features you want to get, you almost need to do a bit of a scoping exercise. And so, using that HR analogy again, I think anytime you want to create a headcount, you have to back it up with a business case and justification of why you need that headcount before you can even go through the process of developing a job description and starting kind of your recruitment process. And so, similar with Martech, I think you need to identify the need as part of your scoping exercise. And so, I kind of look at it as like three levels of need. You kind of have your operational need. So, what is the gap right now that you are trying to address, or what is the gap that you currently have? The second level of need is really the opportunity cost. So, what is it that you're not able to achieve because of that gap that you have? And then the third is, I think, sort of that strategic impact. So, what does this gap, if you're able to fill it, what does this unlock next? How does this level your company up? How does this level your tech stack up? And so, really identifying those three levels of need and ideally quantifying the impact of those, three levels of need. So, what is the actual opportunity cost, based on efficiencies or like additional campaigns or like dollars, whatever that looks like for you? What is the strategic quantifiable impact? I think that really rounds out a justification and validation, not just for yourself, but also for executives or like decision makers in your companies to say, okay, you know what, this does warrant an investment. So that to me is like almost a prerequisite step before you even get into the details of like the features and the specs and like scoping out different candidates or technology to really assess like what's the best fit for you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the right way to do it, but I've been with companies in the past where the script was flipped a little bit, so like it would come top down or bottom up sometimes. So, in the middle of the year or something for an unplanned role, like to your point, coming up with like why are we like hiring for this person? Why do we have the need for this person? I think that makes sense, but like from a longer term budget like cycle standpoint, marketing gets handed a new number from the top down next year for budget. Sometimes there's like a bit of back and forth negotiating what that number might be based on new tools that you want to buy, or maybe sometimes you get handed a bigger number, then you're just like coming up with tools that are going to renew or not renew. And similar to headcount, like sometimes, there's discussions about business numbers and objectives, and then there's back and forth. And then to hit those numbers, the marketing team will say like, well, we need 2 extra headcount. We're kind of making that business case a little bit there too. And I feel
Yeah.
like that angle is what leads to tech debt sometimes, where we get handed this budget and marketing, and then we figure out after what are the tools that we want based on that budget versus doing it the other way around. Whereas these are the things we're trying to do next year. These are the gaps that we have in being able to accomplish that from a person, a people, and a tech standpoint. And this is the budget that we need to make those goals. Have you been on like both sides of that discussion? Do you relate to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so relatable because I think that is unfortunately how a lot of tech companies operate, in a very reactive sort of a
Yeah.
manner where, hey, these are our goals. We need tech or people to make it possible. And you make really quick, sort of unthoughtful decisions when you fall into that trap. And so I think when it comes to Martech specifically, this is why I feel that Mops leadership or just like your Mops team needs to have a seat, but not just a seat, a voice at the table of these strategic conversations. And oftentimes I find that that's the team or the marketing org is just not set up that way. The partnership becomes much more transactional and reactive and like almost service oriented to say that, hey, Mops team, we need to execute this. Go help us do it. And then they kind of figure it out rather than having them be involved as part of the conversation up front. And then they can actually guide the team to say, okay, well, this is, based on our goals, this is what our current capabilities are and how we can support. This is where we're gapped. And then they can kind of develop a more well-informed roadmap for Martech to support the strategic goals. And they can also counter certain things as well if they have that early voice up front. And I find that the reason why oftentimes Mops doesn't have a seat or a voice at the table of these strategic conversations is usually one of two reasons. One, either you don't have a strong Mops leader in place to really they might have the seat at the table, but they're not actually using their voice and really sharing those insights with other senior leaders and cross-functional leaders. And then the other, which is I think the more common reason, is your systems and your workflows and your processes are just not set up to provide Mops that seat at the table. It's very much, your processes are very much, hey, once you have everything figured out, submit a brief and then send it over to your Mops team. And so with that kind of a system in place, you're just not giving your, Mops teams the opportunity to actually engage in that dialogue and that strategic dialogue and really work towards a more unified roadmap and plan for your company.
Yeah, definitely. It's a topic that comes up a lot with guests on the show, this idea of marketing ops being more strategic and making part in those decisions versus being just the execution center, like the ticket center where we just help marketing and sales teams, get campaigns through the door. I think to your point, there's totally an argument for having marketing ops folks having a seat at strategic discussions, especially budget discussions when those happen frequently throughout the year, especially in the year-end cycle, where we do have discussions about our metrics are increasing by 30% next year, and we need to do these 5 new things that we've never done before. We don't know how much these tools are going to cost to get us to do that or how much extra people we're going to need to do that, but let's just put a number in the budget. Let's see if finance approves it or not, and we'll just kind of go with it versus having a marketing ops person scope out this thing that we're trying to do next year. Someone who has experience potentially doing this in the past or has counterparts or is willing to do the research to figure out from a tooling standpoint, what do we need? Where are the gaps? Where are the people gaps? I think that makes a lot of sense there. The other question I had on that was the questions that you would ask during the interview process. So we've got approval for headcount or for new tech tools next year in the budget. We scoped out the description. We're starting to chat with vendors. We're doing the shopping stuff. What interesting questions do you like to ask during the evaluation process? Maybe for employees, but also for Martech tools. So anything that comes to mind?
That's a really good question. I think, it obviously differs heavily for employees versus for tech.
Maybe where the analogy starts to break a bit.
Yeah, I think, at the very core basic level, in any kind of interview or evaluation of candidates or Martech, you obviously need to ensure that it has the fundamental features that you're looking, and it's able to address the gaps that you're looking to solve for. I think the other piece that's always interesting is hearing other companies' experiences with that product. And so these aren't necessarily, curated references or curated customer stories or testimonials, but these are very much reaching out to people who I know have used this product and having a very honest and frank conversation. And I think we'll probably get into this a little bit later more, but I really like to, do my own kind of due diligence on the side, even outside of the interview process, to understand how this Martech has landed with other companies who are in a similar situation or who are facing similar problems or who are looking to grow in similar ways.
Yeah, one thing that I find similar with employees and Martech in this context is, let's say we have an open rec and we don't know exactly if it's better to hire a data person or it's better to hire a technical marketer or it's better to outsource some of those things because we have outsourced budget and the full-time person we hire is your traditional marketing generalist. we don't really know what is the right rec to kind of post up. And we sometimes like don't really know all the time, like who are the right people out there for a specific skill. So maybe we'll like post all 3 postings and then we'll kind of compare people. I see that similarly with Martech too. Like sometimes we just assume, all right, we want to do real-time personalization. We just got to get a CDP. Like everyone talks about a CDP for that use case. That's just a thing. Like we'll post an RFP for a CDP and we'll start like shopping for CDPs. But then there's the other angle of like, what else is there out there that could accomplish the same use case, that could be way cheaper, that could give us a lot more flexibility to do something later down the line and plug in different tools. And it's only like when you think strategically about like what tool could do this specific use case. And so when you're going to shop there, maybe a composable CDP is a better approach
Yes.
for you, being more flexible. And so that angle there is a bit trickier, but I still see the analogy kind of
Yeah.
holding true for that.
Like far too many times I've been involved in recruitment cycles where you're hiring for one particular role, but as the, recruitment cycle progresses and you start to actually talk to candidates, you're like, "Oh, you know what? It'd be great to increase the scope of this role
Yeah,
or
yeah,
evolve the scope based on this person's skills and,
yes.
actually like tackle this problem that we have as well and lump it all together." And so we face kind of like similar challenges with Martech. I think one thing you have to kind of think about beyond just like the problem you're solving for and the solutions that are out there and the specific features, you almost kind of need to zoom out a little bit as well and really question and challenge yourself. Like, is this something that complements the direction that we want to head into as a company? And, on the side, we talked about a little bit about like maturity and versus like complexity of Martech. I think that's an area that, I'm personally like very wary of the very shiny platforms that
Hmm.
promise a lot of like deep functionality. But if no one on your team has the capacity or resources to handle that, then you kind of have to put some brakes on that. And maybe, to your point, a more simple, flexible solution is actually what's going to be more impactful for you at this time and at this stage of your company. So you do have to kind of make those trade-offs, and those are very nuanced by each company and each product. And so you have to kind of have that reality check with yourself.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I've often been like the one person marketing ops team at smaller companies. And we talk about like, oh, what do you think about this tool? We could use it for this and for that. And we already have a stack of like 16 tools that I'm the admin on for all 16 of them. And yeah, we're just going to buy this new tool. Phil, what do you think about it? It's like, who's going to own this tool? Like, at what point do we say we need more than one person on marketing ops to administer and set up and train people on this tool? Like there's so many things to consider from a people standpoint when you
Yes.
do buy that Martech. But I totally relate with your point about like, yeah, sometimes we're deep into the discussion process with a candidate and we discover like, all right, like maybe let's tweak the role for this person because they're a former data engineer. Maybe we're only hiring for like a lifecycle person, but this person is hungry for lifecycle activation, but they're also a data engineer. Let's like tweak that role a little bit. I've seen that so often to kind of justify why a
Yeah.
candidate might be better for another one for a multitude of reasons. Um, when we first talked about this analogy, though, one of the first things that jumped to mind was this idea of like backdoor references when we're later in the interview process with a couple of candidates. This is like a bit of a opinionated subject. Some people hate backdoor because it's like incredibly biased, but some people love it and swear by it. I had Chris Golek, the former founder and CEO of Demandbase, on the show, and he's hired like 1,000+ people in his career. And I asked him this question, like, what's the one thing you could recommend to people to avoid making hiring mistakes? And that was his number one recommendation, like doing backdoor references when you're at the later stages with one or two candidates. Reach out to your VC network or like friends of friends who have worked or maybe, worked in the same company as that person, knowing that maybe their experience is highly biased and it's not fully representative of what that person might be offering. If there's like similar stories from person to person about this individual who portrayed themselves really well in the interview process, there's something there to unpack. There's like yellow flags at the very least. How do you think that applies to Martech? Because I think it's easier said than done to find people in a similar company as yours with
Yeah.
similar use cases who have also used that tool because there's so many tools that do very similar things. What are your thoughts on like backdoor references for Martech?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think it's so interesting that, that was one of the top recommendations. Because I do agree with it somewhat, although I haven't put it to practice in my own recruitment efforts as much as, maybe it would have been valuable. When it happens organically, where you kind of like naturally know someone and it just comes up that, oh, yes, I'm actually talking to this person, I'm interviewing them for a role, and then you kind of like get the real gist. That is truthfully like where you really get to understand how this person operates, what their true weaknesses are, not what their like interview answer weaknesses are. And you really get to the nitty gritty of like, how are they going to operate when things get chaotic and messy, which in tech, you have to be resilient to all of that. And so I do really love that, that's what he emphasized. When it comes to Martech, I think it's similar. And I think it's actually easier to do because to your point, tech is fairly small in the sense, like the tech community is fairly small in the sense, and people are very vocal on LinkedIn or just on all these platforms, sharing their opinions for free on all of this technology. And so it's easy to find people in your own network, even who are actively using a particular technology that you're considering or have used it in the past or know someone who's using it. And so having those outreach efforts, I think really does pay a lot of value to your overall, like forming your opinion and your decision. Now, that being said, I think to your point, I definitely am not the type of person who's going to let one opinion sway
Hmm.
my decision completely. I'm big on like statistical significance and making sure that, my sample is sufficient. But to your point, it does enable you and encourage you to investigate a little bit further. Like if you hear of a really negative opinion or a negative review, it does force you to get a few other sample pieces to really validate that or invalidate that.
Yeah, I've been in that position. Like one of my favorite ways to do that is jump on a Slack community in your niche. There's a lot of marketing ops Slack communities out there, and I'll search for this said tool or this like other tool that I'm looking to get backdoor references on, and I'll find someone who's posted about that tool or has asked about that tool, or maybe they were in that same evaluation process. And then I'll just like cold DM those people on the Slack community, being like, "Hey, I'm thinking of buying this tool. This is my use case. What did you love about it? What did you hate about it?" And sometimes people will be upfront and saying like, "Hey, we didn't use it for this use case at all, but these are the things that we didn't like. We ended up ditching it because of this and because of that." And so it's just like more information for you to have throughout the process that isn't coming from the salesperson or
Yeah.
the solutions architect, who is obviously incentivized to tell you that, oh yeah, that feature we don't have right now, but it's on the roadmap, it's coming super super soon. And then you chat this person on Slack and they're like, yeah, they told us the same thing 2 years
2 years
ago
ago.
and
Yeah.
it's not there yet. So those are things that come out from backdoor references
Yeah.
there. But the other thing that's interesting in this analogy that I thought of was like the culture fit and the Martech fit that you have for your team. Like culture fit and culture add for companies, the big part of hiring. Obviously, I think the same thing applies for Martech. A few folks have said this on the show too, that they think that teams are a strong representation of their tech stacks. And like, not to diss the older legacy Martech tools, but a lot of folks I look up to eventually move on to a company that is playing or like purchasing the leading tools, or innovating and trying market leading solutions, as opposed to just like staying with an old school package solution all in one. Like, yeah, there's no AI features on this tool yet, but they have it on the roadmap for 3 or 4 years down the road. And I don't really care about the UI. Like the UI is okay, even though it's not changed in like 10 years. But I'm curious to ask you, like, how do you think about culture fit when it comes to evaluating tools? Are you looking for something that fits your existing workflows, or one that might be like pushing you to level up and think about things a bit differently?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think when it comes to fit in general and like, I guess, yeah, culture fit as well, I think there's two levels of like fit when I'm assessing. So one is, yes, that culture fit at the organization level. And I do think your tech stack says a lot about your culture as a company. Are you centralized? Are you democratized? Are you flexible? Are you, like how do you operate as a company? How do you think as a company? How do you grow or not grow as a company? And so I do think it's important to ensure that, the tech stack that you're adopting is in line with your values and representative of your brand and how you want to be perceived. And then the second level of fit is how this tech stack fits into, or how this technology fits into the rest of your tech stack and the rest of your ecosystem. I
Hmm.
think that's also a really important evaluation that, oftentimes when we're just like testing and learning or like experimenting with this technology or that technology, we're not as like intentional about that. But when you're actually looking to integrate something into your ecosystem for the long run, you have to think about how it fits in with the rest of your technology. Is it going to, force you to invest in other technology to like, reverse ETL or to like just make sure that everything is connecting? Is it going to like, force you to have like more of an investment in other technology rather than just like this one technology that you're thinking about? So you have to kind of think about fit at both of those levels, the, company culture fit, and then just your like tech stack ecosystem fit. And so those are, I think, two really important fields. But then one other one that I think often people miss is beyond fit. Does this tool create friction?
Mm.
And I think it kind of goes hand in hand with like when you're assessing your tech stack and how it all fits in and connects into that. But, really thinking about like, will this tool challenge us in the right ways? Will it force us to raise our operating standard? Or is it just going to end up becoming a blocker and something that people don't want to use? And they're like, oh, like we have to like go through this thing and like, fill out this and deal with that. So I think finding that sweet spot of like a tool that respects where you are, but doesn't let you stay there, if that makes sense, like
Yeah.
continues to like elevate you and ensures that you're making progress towards the things that you're trying to improve and the problems that you're trying to solve for, but also does it respectfully.
Yeah, such a good point. I think that's why it's important to have the users, like the end users that are going to be using this tool as part of the decision-making
Yes.
committee. This episode is brought to you by MoEngage and their new warehouse native CEP, which revolutionizes the way data should be seamlessly fetched, analyzed, and activated. Now you can use MoEngage Cloud Data Sync to sync your warehouse data with MoEngage and use it to segment audiences or personalize messages without any development. Just set and forget. Use MoEngage warehouse segments to create segments on your warehouse data without moving underlying events, properties, or proprietary segmentation logic, and activate them directly on MoEngage. Using warehouse data analytics, brands can also directly generate insights from their warehouse data. Your long search solution for seamless data sync, smarter segmentation, dynamic personalization, and delightful customer experiences ends here. Warehouse native CEP from MoEngage, making it easy, smart, and secure. Learn more at moengage.com.
This episode is brought to you by Revenue Hero. You've invested thousands in your marketing funnel, targeted the right ICP, spent weeks A/B testing, and optimized for conversion at every step. Finally, a high-intent prospect fills out your demo form, and then nothing. Your nurtured lead sits in a queue while you chase them with, "How's Thursday at 2 p.m.?" Meanwhile, your competitor is already on a discovery call. That's not just frustrating, that's revenue walking away. With Revenue Hero, you can qualify, route, and book leads with the right rep, so your team can start real conversations right away. For the ops folks listening, Revenue Hero syncs meeting data to your CRM, auto-credits no-shows, recalibrates when reps go on vacation, and has a ton of smart features you won't find anywhere else. If you're spending to drive demand, don't lose it at the last mile. Visit revenuehero.io/demo today.
Oftentimes, Martech is lucky enough to be part of that buying committee, and we're deciding, like this new CRM add-on tool that we're adding that our sales team is going to be using. We need to have those salespeople in those conversations and be part of demos and evaluate whether they think this is something they see themselves using. And there's like a trade-off there too, right? Like there's a whole change management process to things where, at some point you can't always have the salesperson or the end user saying like, no, I don't see myself doing that. Like my current process is fine. Like at some point we do need to change if like most people in the room agree that this is the better way of building things or the better way of doing something. And so it's a bit of a trade-off there. But I was thinking of like the devil's advocate on this whole idea that like the team is a strong representation of your tech stack, because as I was saying that, I was like, shit, like this is true for the teams that are the ones empowered to make decisions about the tech stacks. And I feel like those teams are pretty rare, especially in the companies I've worked at. Like oftentimes the friggin' senior management team is the one like with the final word on Martech decisions. And they're the last person that's going to be using the tool. They're the last person who is well informed about the future of Martech and what is the right way to do things. But they have an investor on the board who also uses that tool. And you know what? Like, if they're using it, we're going to be using it. And you spend like months and months of research evaluating, and then you're down to two tools. You're advocating for one, and then senior management comes in. They're just like, you know what? We're going to use that one. Like, thanks for all the blood, sweat, and tears you poured into that research. And so I feel like sometimes that's a representation more of leadership, like the tech stack side of things. Because like you join a company and the person in marketing ops is just like, yeah, I actually hate this tool, and we've tried moving off of it like 7 times, and we've been blocked by senior leadership because they're the ones making the call and stuff.
Yeah, and I think that that's unfortunate, but I think, to kind of take back control for, let's say, like a Mops team or the team that's like directly involved in the tools, like daily management, you kind of have to take ownership of providing your leadership with insights on ROI of this tool. And I think that's a step that's often missed. When we think about humans and people, like we at our employees, we have performance goals and we have very like structured performance reviews and like rating structures and all of that. And, there's a systemic way for us to be evaluated on a regular basis and have that feedback shared back with leadership to figure out our game plan. Like, are we staying? Are we going? Are we growing? Are we getting promoted? Whatever that looks like. Are we getting put on a development plan? We don't have that same level of reporting back to leadership when it comes to our tech stack. Oftentimes I've seen that as a huge gap. And so, I think leadership in general, they talk money. And if you're able to kind of show them that, hey, this is just burning out money. This is causing a lot of tech debt, and it's not really providing any incremental value. I think with that kind of backing, I don't see why you wouldn't be able to persuade them in a different direction. But I think the onus is oftentimes it has to be on your marketing operational leaders to provide those insights in a more real-time, regular, consistent way. And eventually they'll get the message.
Yeah, that was actually one of the questions I had on my list, like the topic of KPIs compared to Martech versus people that we're hiring on the team. Like this is somewhat of a similar process in a sense that like you need to think about the ROI of Martech and assigning specific KPIs to new tools. In a sense, sometimes it's easier said than done. You often have assigned KPIs for new employees and like team-wide KPIs. So maybe they're just like fitting into the lifecycle team and they have like product adoption and retention as part of the team-wide metric. This is a bit trickier with Martech though, because you're trying to measure efficiency sometimes or
Right.
the effectiveness of an existing use case. And so it's easier said than done a lot of times. Like how have you tackled this? Like when you're building that business case for the job description for a new Martech tool and you're trying to assign a KPI to it, because eventually you're going to get asked that question. All right, you want to buy a lead routing tool or you want to buy a reverse ETL tool. What is the ROI of that? And sometimes, you can kind of like piece it together and estimate like what that ROI might be, but you don't have hard data all the time. Like what are some tactics that you've gone around that when you were faced?
Yeah, you're right. It is a lot trickier and tougher to measure the ROI of MarTech. It's easier said than done. And I think that's why oftentimes, especially MarTech that you've had as part of your tech stack for like 5 years or 10 years, no one is looking at those. No one is questioning those anymore. Whereas I think newer MarTech, you're a little bit more on top of. Um, but I think there's always sort of proxy metrics that you can start to lean into as early as day one or week one or month one. And so I usually like to start with the very like basic adoption metrics, I would say, in the first 30 days. And 30 days is like a very like generalized statement. When you have a much more like robust technology, then obviously 30 days might not be sufficient to measure even like adoption. But whatever that right threshold is, timeline, I think adoption is a good way to start getting a directional sense of, one, is your team using it, which tells me like, are they finding it useful? Is this like somewhat useful? And then once you have a good, grasp on like, okay, it's, successfully it's onboarded, people are using it, the people are activated on it, then you can start to kind of move to, I would say, like some of the more performance-based metrics. And those also become pretty hard to measure, I would say. But ultimately, you want to use a metric that you're going to be able to say, are we better off because of it? And that's a very like blanket, vague statement, but better for you could be number of campaigns that you're shipping in a given month. Is it going from like 10 to 30? Is it going from 10 to 12? Is it just going from 10 to 10 and there's really no change as of yet? And then investigating, okay, why is there no change? Is it because, it's still taking time, your cycles are longer, your reporting cycles are longer, whatever that looks like? Or is it truly because this isn't actually moving the needle, and continuing to collect that data every month? And I would say by month 6, again, loose timeline differs heavily from, technology to technology, but by month 6, you should start to have a more stronger opinion on the prospects of this tool. And I think, the biggest mistake I see is, waiting until the end of your contract to then make that evaluation at that time. So when the account executive reaches out to you and say, hey, let's renew your contract, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess, yeah, we'll look into it and we'll see. And you don't have the insights to make an informed decision. And we know how busy every marketing team is, and you kind of make that decision really quickly and say, okay, cool, we'll just renew for another year and then we'll kind of see how it plays out. But instead, you can go in from like month 6 to 12, you're already racking a lot of data and insights and have a real pulse to say, okay, this has actually moved the needle on the problem that we're trying to solve, and then be able to have a more productive conversation with the account executive to discuss the whys and the why nots.
Yeah, such a great answer. I love the point about having milestones with key dates when you're implementing a new tool, and you tie those milestones to the use cases that you originally got approval to purchase that thing in the first place. Like there was an ROI picture that you painted to get approval for it in the first place, and that was tied to use cases and what are we actually going to do with this thing? Send more campaigns or send less campaigns sometimes, and better campaigns, more optimized. So sometimes like a segmentation angle or more personalization there. And so you would tie those milestones to those use cases. We said we were going to buy this tool to do X and Y. By month 6, we're going to have all of our data fully integrated from the warehouse in there. And by like month 8, we're going to be sending out at least 3 optimized campaigns post acquisition, blah, blah, blah. And so like at least you're able to show we purchased this tool. We said we were going to buy it to do X, Y, and Z. Here's proof that we hit these milestones to do X, Y, and Z. And now we're reporting on whether those things are actually like driving revenue or not. But that's a whole other conversation.
And it's also like, it's tough because oftentimes you're using that type of a technology for the first time. And so you don't necessarily have baselines to say, definitively at the time of scoping that you are going to increase the quality or like receptibility or deliverability of your campaigns by X percent. It's hard to say that. So you're using kind of industry benchmarks or benchmarks that maybe the vendor has provided you with to set those baselines. And so you have to have a little bit of a flexibility in your KPI measurement to say, okay, you know what, we didn't get to this industry standard, but this is the progress we've made, and we see this continuing to improve. We continue to invest or expand in this way. So you have to be a little bit flexible with your approach, not super rigid, but at the same time having, I think to your point, those milestones and those metrics along the way is really helpful.
Yeah, you mentioned adoption metrics also, and getting feedback from people earlier than like later in the renewal process when you're implementing a new tool. And I've done this at bigger companies. Like in smaller companies, it's harder to do because we're in the entry level plan, and the Martech vendors don't offer this like trial period or like a sandboxing period. But I'm always a huge advocate of trying to figure out a way to get feedback from team members early on in the process, even before you're implementing that tool. Like you're implementing it in a sandbox environment, you're doing a proof of concept for like 1, 2, 3 months or whatever. And it made me think to like, all right, what's the analogy with hiring someone and like treating Martech like your recruiting efforts? And I'm curious to get your take on this idea of POCs for people, like take home projects, and even like stretching that a bit further into like trials. So I had a short stint at WordPress.com at Automatic, and they take this like very seriously. So very much like you would purchase Martech, like you do the evaluation, interviews, whatever, you have a candidate that you want to hire, but instead of sending them a contract and then seeing like how they're going to do in the first 30, 60, 90 days, they actually make you go through a take-home project that's actually like a trial project. And it's really like I'm opinionated because oftentimes people are applying for these roles and they have a full-time role already. So you're asking this person to spend like 10, 15, 20 hours per week with a second company. Sometimes it's like there's cross contract obligations there. But anyways, it was a really interesting project. And I saw a lot of analogies with like the right way to build a proof of concept and sandbox when possible with some of your tools. No, it's not always possible with like regulated industries or whatever, but what are your thoughts on like take home projects and like even like this idea of like having a trial period with someone and getting to know them, getting feedback from people and like, hey, this person's not a good fit. We don't have to go through the whole process of like doing a performance improvement plan in the first like 30, 60 day, 90 period, maybe as like probation. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I feel like I'm in the camp of not being a huge fan of these really heavy take-home exercises when it comes to people recruitment. And simply because I think the the thing that you're trying to answer is can they do the job and how effectively can they do the job? And I think when it comes to, people, you can get a lot of that answered through the time commitment that they've already made through various rounds and stages and panels of interviews with you. Some circumstances can warrant it, like a very technical type of a role, but um, generally not a fan. Now, that being said, for Martech, I think this is where my opinion differs a little bit. And it differs even, it's more nuanced, within the type of Martech that you're investing in. Um, Again, if it's just like experimental and a very like minute part of your overall product and customer experience or your internal employee experience, then maybe it doesn't require that level of rigor. You can or maybe it's not like as much of a budget commitment either, or like a resource commitment. You can kind of go in with not necessarily your blinders, but like you can still kind of take some risks there. Whereas I think if you're investing in technology that's going to be an integral part of your business and your overall like operating model, you do need to kind of take an extra step to do your due diligence. I'll share an example of this. We did a couple of years ago. This was actually before my time, so can't take credit for this, but I think it's a good example nonetheless about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is contact enrichment. And so a couple of years ago, we were, looking at a few different vendors to integrate into our pipeline that would enrich the leads that are coming in with all the different fields that we wanted to be able to kind of route them effectively and send them on the right personalized nurture experience and all that. And I think the three vendors that we were, kind of like validating this with was Clearbit, ZoomInfo, and Demandbase was the third one. I won't share my share like our insights, but essentially what the team did was they provided sort of a sampled list of contacts to the three vendors,
Hmm.
and this is a very like scrappy, but like provides like a bit of a proof of concept.
Yeah.
They provided just a generic list of contacts, and then just observed and analyzed the enrichment rates across the three different
Yeah.
platforms to see which one kind of had the winning
Hmm.
winning impact for the fields that were most critical for us and our business and our routing rules and all that. And ultimately, like the team only had the capacity and the budget to integrate one of the three. We couldn't like integrate multiple at that time, and so we ended up picking the one that drove the highest results. And when you look at these, a lot of these solutions on the surface, they're all very similar. They're all credible. They have great reputations. They have great reviews. Really solid proof points and customer testimonials and case studies and all that. So on the surface, everything looks very similar. Their pricing models are similar as well. So you almost have to kind of like do that extra step of due diligence to make that final call and that final distinction of what's going to be best for your business needs at that time. So that was an example that I thought was a good one to kind of showcase how you have to kind of go that extra mile and provide almost a take-home assignment to your technology solutions.
Very cool. Yeah, I appreciate the practical example there. Yeah, three really cool vendors, a really powerful use case there. And I think that one specifically for that niche like subcategory of Martech is a very valid one for doing like a quick like POC. Let me send you a couple of leads. Another one that we had on the show recently was Allegro. They do like contact validation, like email validation plus more stuff. So like they tell you the likeliness that someone is like not a good contact to reach out to if
Oh,
you're
wow.
doing like outbound stuff. So like how likely is that person to mark you as spam, or how likely are they part of like an inbox provider with a ton of like safety net rules, blah blah blah. And so you can quickly do a proof of concept with them, same format, send them a subset of your list, and they come back with like, yeah, these are like 150 people that you should never email in the future. And just that alone like improves
Powerful.
some of your stuff. So yeah, the proof of concept for sure is easier said than done in certain scenarios. And yeah, I mostly agree with you with like this idea that, take home projects and doing a trial, you're asking so much from the candidate. Like the onus often is on you to do the evaluation process in the like 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds of interviews you've already had.
Yeah.
But the other angle to that is like I actually enjoyed the prospect, the process from a candidate standpoint at Automatic, because how often have, and I know you've been at like Shopify for quite a bit of time. You were at Dropbox for quite a bit of time. If you look at my resume, I'm a bit more of like the red flag, like this person bounces between roles like here and there. And like what I found is like sometimes the interview process from my point of view like looks great. The senior management team looks amazing. The team members look great. The tech stack looks great. Promises of like greener pastures, and then you join, and within a couple of weeks, you're just like, what did I do? Like, this is a mess. And every company is like not perfect. Everyone has like things, but like there are certain things that come out really early when you join a company that you're just like, yeah, nobody told me about this in the interview process. And I wish that was an extra data point in my evaluation grid, because maybe I wouldn't have taken that leap. And that shit comes up in the trial process. Like I got to like work for 2 weeks with my hiring manager who would eventually become my boss. And I got to meet the data team who I would be working with on propensity models. And I got to meet the engineer who's building the in-house custom data platform. And so I don't know, like the experience was really cool because I got a lot more information than I would have from a candidate standpoint in the interview process. Very similar kind of way, but I don't know, you flip that with like the Martech analogy, and it's like, do vendors really care about getting to know potential customers? Not really. Like the analogy breaks a little bit there.
Yeah, like, I think it's different needs or, like, motives to go that extra step, but I
Yeah.
think, the actions or the way you do it is similar, and I think it goes back to our talk conversation about backdoor references. I think they're
Hmm.
applicable just as much to the hiring manager as they are
Mm.
to the candidate as well. Like, you should be asking people in your network, like, "Hey, give me the real deal. You worked here for a while. Like, what was the experience
That's
like?
so true.
How toxic is the culture? And, how do they deal with change?" And so how's the leadership? And so I think, yeah, the back to reference comment is really helpful to both the candidate as well as the recruiter.
Yeah. One of the other areas that the analogy starts to break a little bit for me is with hiring managers. So, like when you hire a person on your team, there's typically a hiring manager who ends up being the direct report for that individual. Not all the time. Like sometimes the person doing the leading the interviews and writing the job description doesn't end up like leading that person. But I think most of the time, the person who's going to report to that eventual hire is part of that the decision making process in the interview process. Just like in Martech, there's often many voices on the decision making committee, a lot of people in the interview process. But what I've seen often with like a hiring manager for Martech, if you will, isn't always the person who ends up owning the tool post purchase. Do you kind of see that in your experience? Like, what are your thoughts there? How do you decide who owns a Martech tool after you purchase it? Do you ever see tools kind of fall through the cracks because no one kind of stepped up post purchase?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, um, being in a B2B environment, we know that, even as a business trying to sell to customers or being a customer trying to purchase Martech, that there's multiple personas and user types throughout that buyer journey. You typically have an IT decision maker, you have your procurement team, you have the economic buyer, and then you have the ultimate like admin or owner or whatever you want to kind of call them. And then you have your power users and then you have the non-users. And so you kind of have to, if your organization is, large enough where you have a lot of these roles, you do need to like define them early on to understand how each role kind of plays into the various stages of the buyer journey, but also the adoption journey as well of that tech stack. And I think that's, often a miss. I've seen that happen at companies where they're either early stage or they're like growing and, rapidly changing their org structures, or there's layoffs happening, which happens in tech all the time. So oftentimes you lose that ownership of a particular tool for, various reasons. And, this happened for us, at the time of, we were launching a product, and, one of the lead gen sources that we wanted to have was a live demo. And it ended up being kind of one of the highest lead generators for us. So it was really powerful. It was a very simple tool that we kind of invested in, nothing like super fancy, but just like, did the job that we needed it to do. And we stood it up really quickly. But then, after a number of like reorgs and changes that we had, we lost a clear owner of that tool. And I think that, loss of ownership really was kind of led to an opportunity cost of us not maximizing the full potential of that tool by, optimizing and iterating on it. And people had a lot of great ideas, but those ideas fell through the cracks because they didn't know who to go to make those updates and optimizations. So I think, I see this happen quite often is with all of those changes and that chaos, you do lose ownership. But I think as a Mops team or as a marketing org and a marketing leadership team, you need to always ensure that every technology has a tool, has a backup, or has an owner and has a backup owner as well, to ensure that you're continuing to be accountable for it and you're continuing to get the most value out of it.
Yeah, such a good point. I feel like that's what sometimes makes Mops teams, or like sometimes the one person Mops person
The one Mops
have
person.
yeah, have a really good like retention power on the team. Like they are the admins of some of the core infrastructure tools that you have in the company. And, if they leave, we need to figure out a backup solution here. And oftentimes the default is, all right, let's post up a rec, let's backfill the role. But in the meantime, like we need someone to figure that stuff out. So we outsource it and we find an agency to come in, backfill for a couple months, even help us with the hiring process. And then we hire that person. But the whole like backfill discussion is an interesting comparison to the analogy, because like just like in hiring, sometimes it's not a new tool or it's not a new role, you're backfilling, or you're trying to like upgrade. Sometimes you're like moving on from a tool. In the Martech world, like that means a massive migration project. And we're chatting about this before we press record. Folks who've had the pleasure of several battle scars from migration projects, like the both of us have, in small and big teams, like these are massive projects. And I've seen this all the time. Like I'm at a company, we like our stack, like things are fine. New senior leader joins and they're just like, oh, you guys aren't using X tool. Like I've used X tool at 2 of my last companies. I'm pretty sure it's better than this. Or like, and they don't take time interviewing people. And like, if the current stack is okay, and they're just like, the first thing I'm going to do as a new senior leader team is just going to rip out a couple of things from the stack. And when they ask me like, what have I done? Like, I saved a bunch of time and money by like ripping out these 2 tools and I'm bringing in this new tool. I don't know. I feel like there's like for sure a migration of project and tasks and ownerships that you have when you have a backfill employee, but it doesn't feel as like intense as migrating a key Martech tool. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like the unfortunate times that I've been part of migrations at, throughout my career, it's always been, it continues to be a triggering point, because it's never like a happy, fun experience to go through a migration. And oftentimes these are multi-year projects
Yeah.
that continue to extend, timelines continue to get pushed. And then I think the hardest part of it is dealing with the transition. So like the carryover from,
Mhm.
your old technology and all the mess there, and like, the new, and how it all kind of comes together in a seamless way. And oftentimes, I've seen that you wrap up the project and for like years to come, that mess is still not fully clean. And like, people are still like, new people are joining the team. They're like, what is this? Like, what does this mean? Like, this is not completely misaligned or inconsistent with how we're currently reporting or how our data is currently enriched. Like, what does this field mean? And it is tricky. And I haven't, to be honest, like seen any one example from my like, years of experience to say that migration went so smoothly. Everything went fantastic. There were no issues. And we're just like smooth sailing. So yeah, migration is not fun. Yeah, it's weirdly easier with people. Oftentimes you have people going on mat leave or paternity leave or whatever that looks like. And it's easier to kind of fill in that gap short term, even though it might not be as good, or maybe it's a little bit better, who knows? But it's easier to do that with people than it is with technology, because technology gets so ingrained in your company's DNA, in your overall operating model and your systems, that it's harder to make that change. Versus I think with people, sometimes depending on like their level of seniority and their overall impact, it can be a little bit easier, unfortunately.
Yeah, I will say I've never done a migration at your scale compared to like Shopify and Dropbox. Like I can't imagine. I think like some of the bigger ones too, like might have come from acquisitions, and then this new acquiring team has their own tech stack, and it's like, all right, how are we merging those two things together? Yeah, lots of folks have chatted about that. I agree. I don't think there's ever been a migration project in Martech where it went 100% smoothly.
Yeah.
This is like where agencies, I feel like, are perfectly suited to come in and just be like, hey, we have a plug and play process for this. We've done 17 migrations from that tool and that tool. That's exactly what you guys are doing. We're going to do the whole setup for you guys. You guys will focus on like that transition period, but like there's still like so much context to it and nuance to what you're doing, and they're like trying to audit your systems, and they're like, all right, like what are these 17 nurture flows, and do we still need all 7 to recreate in the new one? And then you have to spend time explaining what those were created for, and maybe the person who created them isn't even with the team anymore. And there's a whole
Exactly.
process of like cutting, improving, optimizing. Yeah, I feel like
Yeah.
I hit a nerve there a bit.
Yep.
And
You definitely did.
this has been super fun. Yeah, I think that there's probably a bunch of other areas that maybe listeners are thinking about, how to treat their MarTech stack, like recruiting efforts, like HR efforts. There's probably a couple areas we could have jumped in there, but I got one last question that we ask everyone on the show. You're obviously a director of growth, you're a team leader, but I home you're also a mother, and you're an outdoor fanatic, an avid hiker. One question we ask everyone on the show is, how do you remain happy and successful in your career? And how do you find balance between all the stuff you're working on while staying happy?
Yeah, I love this question, and I love that you ask your guests this, because I think it just gives an insight into how they think and operate it personally outside of work as well. I think for me, honestly, I feel like earlier on in my career, or like even in like my 20s, it was very much about striving for perfection, and that's how I was kind of like raised, that you have to like aim for perfection. And I found that anchoring on perfection as your metric for happiness was setting yourself up for unhappiness. And so for me, it's really become more about progress over perfection. And that's really where I get my source of happiness. So whether it's
Hmm.
progress at work and, making sure that I'm doing work that's impactful, how the team is progressing, how they're growing, how we're, getting closer to our goals. And then same with my personal life, how I'm developing as a person, how I'm seeing my daughter grow and learn and develop every day. I think seeing that delta is the sweet spot for me in finding that happiness. And I've learned that the hard way, anchoring on perfection, but I've realized over many years that nothing is ever going to be perfect. And so you kind of just have to focus on the progress that you're making as an individual, as an employee, as a family, mom or dad or whatever it is, and really lean on that for your source of happiness.
Love that answer, Samia. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for sharing that analogy, introducing folks to it, and all your stories and practical examples. Really appreciate your time. This is super fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Phil.